July 2020 is going to go down as the biggest month in camera manufacturing history. Canon announced their R5, which is the 8K recording beast of a camera. Blackmagic announced their 12K RAW recording camera for under $10,000. Nikon announced their Z5, which is the budget full-frame mirrorless camera. And then next week, Sony is going to be announcing the much-awaited Sony A7S III. Almost all of the information in this video is coming from SonyAlphaRumors.com, which is the premier website for, as you guessed it, rumors about Sony Alpha cameras. Now, the A7S III is a camera that I've been following very closely for the last few years, and for the last few years, the specs have been varying wildly. I mean, it started off as an 8K camera, and now it's a 4K camera. However, Sony still promises this to be a revolutionary camera. Now, what does revolutionary mean? I have no clue, but based on the specs from the last few posts from Sony Alpha Rumors, I do believe that some of these are true. Now, I do believe, obviously, it's going to be shooting 4K 60 at 10-bit. And to be honest, I think the 4K 60 10-bit is going to be the baseline for almost any mirrorless camera that wants to be taken sort of seriously in the video market. Now, some of the other specs are 4K 120 frames per second, which is very exciting because previously I've basically been limited to shooting 1080 for almost all of my video projects because I couldn't get that slow motion when I needed it. So to have that in 4K is going to be huge and game-changing. Now, one of the confusing things about this spec is you have 4K 60 and, obviously 4K 24 as well, shooting 10-bit 422. Now, just the way that cameras have worked for the last few years, you'd always expect the biggest spec, the 4K 60 frames per second to be, the absolute monster. That's what the camera is known for. And then you have the slow motion, which of course, because there's more frames being pumped through the camera, a lot of the data has to be compressed or something has to be given up to make that spec possible. So on one hand, you have the 4K 60 10-bit 422, and then on the other hand, you have the 4K 120 10-bit 422. So something's got to give here. What spec are you giving up from the 4K 60 or the 4K 24 that you're not getting with the 4K 120 frames per second? Now, you might argue maybe it's a lower bit rate at the 4K 120 and it's a higher bit rate over here, but to be honest, that doesn't make too much sense to me because, like I said, in the past, you've previously had your monster spec, where previously, oh man, this camera can do 4K 60 frames per second, but it can only do 1080 120 frames per second. So there's something different there. Now, you might think, well, maybe the 4K 60 can shoot RAW, but the most recent specs from Sony Alpha Rumors has been suggesting that this actually cannot shoot internal RAW. I'm a little bit hesitant about this spec, and I'll give you a few reasons why. Sony has claimed that they are not going to have any overheating issues on this camera in the 4K 60 or 4K 120 modes, and they have a new passive cooling on the back that's supposed to be able to prevent this. Now, the reason that this is a big deal is because with the 4K modes, you're going to be looking at maybe an H.264 or H.265 video format coming out of the camera. And with those formats, it creates a lot of heat because it's really power intensive on the cameras, which is why all of these cameras have been having problems the last few years overheating. So if the camera can do 4K 60 internal and 4K 120 internal, the problem shouldn't be with the heat of the camera, because with RAW recording, believe it or not, it's actually less intensive on the camera to create those RAW files. What you have to really contend with is the data rates going through the camera. So where previously the bottlenecks for these formats would have been heat, now the bottleneck that is probably a concern is the data throughput to the memory cards, which brings me to my next point. These cameras are supposedly going to be the first cameras we'll see with the new CFexpress Type A cards. And this is a big deal because previously, we all know and love those SD cards that we probably have a dozen of shaking around in our backpacks, but everybody knows that the R5 is also going to have a CFexpress card in it. However, the CFexpress card in the R5 is going to be a Type B, and the CFexpress card in the Sony A7S III is going to be a Type A. Now, what's the difference between these two? The Type B is slightly larger, and it has a max data speed of 2,000 megabytes per second, and the Type A is half that at 1,000 megabytes per second, which is still massive. That's a huge data rate. Just to put that into perspective, the R5, the crowning achievement of that R5 is the 8K RAW recording, which requires 2,600 megabits per second write speed. So if you don't know the difference between byte and bit, they're actually two completely separate things. 1 byte is equivalent to 8 bits. And when you're talking about data rates, that can greatly change what you perceive for speeds. Let's say you're talking about 800 megabits per second. 800 megabits per second is equivalent to 100 megabytes per second. So when you see that Type A card and you think, oh, it can only do half of the Type B card, 1,000 megabytes per second is equivalent to an 8,000 megabit per second data rate. So that's way beyond what the R5 is even putting out for the 8K video. So with this new A7S III and the Type A card going in there, I really struggle to believe that they can't get enough data flowing into the new Type A card with 1,000 megabytes per second data rate. Now, this is all based on speculation of what Sony Alpha Rumors has basically given us on their website, but if it can deal with the heat of 4K 60 compressed, it can probably also deal with the heat of the RAW video recording as well. And it also has more than enough capability to dump all of that raw data on the memory cards. So there's another pretty wild rumor out there that the Sony A7S III will also be able to do 4K 120 frames per second RAW out of the HDMI port. Now, we've actually seen leaked photos of the Sony A7S III with a full-size HDMI plug on the side. And actually, on those leaked images, surprisingly, if you look really close, you can see that it's shooting 4K 100 frames per second, and I would suspect that it's also doing it out of the HDMI port as well. So that does sound pretty wild, especially when there's not a recorder on the market right now that can do 4K 120 frames per second RAW. However, after doing a little bit of digging, and honestly it wasn't really that hard to find either, there's actually footage of the CEO of Atomos talking about a recorder that they were going to have come out in late 2019 that had the capability to do 4K 120 frames per second RAW.
We've got the FX9 from Sony. It's a bigger camera, but it's doing 4K 120 RAW, and we're going to capture up to 16-bit RAW. That won't be on our normal 4K line of products because it's quite heavy data rate, but we've announced an 8K control unit for the back of the Neon where you can swap out the 4K one and put an 8K one, so you don't need another panel. You just buy the master unit and a new one, and that will be available early next year, and that'll be supporting the new Sony FX9 camera.
Now, this recorder is actually specifically mentioned to work with the Sony FX9, which again was supposed to be able to do 4K 120 frames per second RAW out of the HDMI port. So it doesn't seem like that wild of a rumor if it can do that, because they've already talked about another Sony camera that can do it. Granted, it's a $10,000 or $11,000 Sony camera, and Sony probably does have it in their best interest to protect some of their higher level cinema cameras. However, as wild as it sounds, it's probably not out of the realm of possibility for this camera. So one more rumor I did see kind of thrown out there by the Sony Alpha Rumors website is that the A7S III is going to be able to record its gyroscope information into a metadata file, just like the FX9. Now, when I looked this up, I actually didn't even know it existed, but the Sony FX9 can record its gyroscope information in the internal gyroscope in the camera to a metadata file. And what you do with this new metadata file is you can take it into a third-party program and it stabilizes it based on the camera positioning at the time. So rather than having to work with like Premiere and its warp stabilizer tool, which we all know is kind of a nightmare sometimes, it records all that information ahead of time, and if you need to have that clip stabilized, you'll have a slightly cropped image, but a much more stable image. Now, one of the things I did see about this that I thought might be a little bit of an issue is that when reading about this stabilization software and how the FX9 uses it, it can't be used in conjunction with lens stabilization. And I suspect this is just because there's not metadata information coming from the camera lens and it can't record that in camera as well. Now with the A7S III, you're gonna have kind of a few different issues to deal with here. You're gonna have stabilized lenses, and you're also gonna have the in-body image stabilization and the gyroscope information. So I don't know if the FX9 can't deal with this, even just a lens. I don't know how it's going to be able to deal with the lens, the sensor, and the gyroscope information. Now, it could, maybe Sony figured some magic out and now they'll have like the best in class image stabilization in their camera, but I think that's kind of a long shot. However, I do think that they still will have this ability to record the internal metadata. And if that's true, they probably won't end at just the stabilization data. They'll probably also record all of the other important metadata in camera as well. A lot of cinema cameras out there record shutter angle, ISO, aperture, lens information. All of that stuff needs to be recorded. And in fact, with that stabilization software, it will also need to know the focal length of the lens on the camera. And that leads me to a little bit more of an interesting thought about this. If it's going to be recording the metadata on the clip, like ISO and shutter angle and all that stuff, that's something that is also required for raw recording internally. So that does add just a little bit more of a nugget of hope that this camera will be able to do 4K raw internal. Obviously, this is all just wild speculation. I'm honestly probably going to be proven wrong in the next few days with either another rumor that comes out or, you know, we will wait until the 28th when it finally gets officially announced, and you guys can all laugh at me down in the comments. Let me know how dumb it was that I thought of this or that I didn't think of this. But I'm just trying to put, you know, a few things together. If it can handle the heat, if it can handle the data, if it's recording the metadata, I think it all points towards this camera being able to record raw, but I could be wrong. I could be dumb. I could be thinking more of Sony than what they will actually produce. Yeah, that's all I have for right now. I'll probably talk about the A7S III next week when it's announced. You can tell I'm excited about it. I probably won't be able to afford it when it first comes out, but I can still hope. So thank you guys for watching the entire video. Let me know down below what you think about this camera. Are you excited about it? And I'll see you on the next one.